All right, good afternoon. We will at this time call to order the August 26th, 2020 Diversion Land Management Committee to order. Could we get a roll call to make sure we've got a quorum, please?
Mrs. Sherling.
I am here.
Mayor Judd. Mr. Grubb.
Here.
Mr. Campbell.
Here.
Mr. Boerboom.
Here.
Mr. Hendrickson. Mr. Olson.
Here.
Mr. Breitling.
Yes.
Ms. Monjo. Mrs. Peterson.
Here.
Mr. Zimmerman. A quorum is present.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. You have an agenda before you. Are there any additions or changes to that agenda? Or a motion to approve?
Say, Mary, this is Eric. One thing I noted is that the page numbers on the front of the agenda got messed up. We'll cover that, not a big deal, hopefully, but otherwise no comments.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So noted. Any other changes to the agenda or motion to approve?
Campbell moves to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Olson seconds.
Thank you. All opposed, say aye. Moving on to item 3, the minutes of the previous meeting. Are there any additions or changes to the minutes? Or motion to approve? Motion to approve, please.
Campbell moves to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Grubb second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All those opposed say aye. And the motion carries. Let's talk about property acquisitions. Is that you, Eric?
Yeah, thank you. In your packet, it actually begins on page 19. Apologize, some confusion on my part with getting the page numbers correct. But anyway, in your packet on page 19 is the status report. I'm going to scroll down to that here on the online screen for those that are paying attention as well. This is the usual property status report that you've seen in months past. The first page is just basically to orientate yourself with the project. The second page is an overall status map showing the overall status of acquisitions. And a few things here to point out. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we have acquired 395 parcels at the time of this report, which was done about a week ago. So we're closing in real closely on that 400 parcel count, continuing to make progress, sort of slow, steady progress as we go. A few other things that I would point out on here. We have been showing the biogeo monitoring parcels on this same map, and you can see there's some yellow shaded parcels down towards Kindred and way down south of Wolverton and way up north of Georgetown as well. Those are biotic and geomorphic monitoring sites that the Corps and their contractors are actually doing that monitoring work right now here in August. We've been working to acquire easements on many of those parcels and rights of entries on the other half of those parcels. And so there's a lot of activity going on in the field right now, and you can see that this sort of the geographic spread of where those parcels is located is beyond the reach of our actual project as we know it. So there's some interesting environmental monitoring work going on. This is really part of the Corps' adaptive management program. You've probably heard some about this in the past. That's a pretty big effort to acquire the property rights for those, to secure all those easements. In the coming months, we do anticipate pulling those parcels onto a separate map where you can sort of see the status of those separate from the rest of the footprint parcels. The other thing that I wanted to just briefly point out is on this map, as of about a little over a week ago, we did have 2 parcels that have tripped into the condemnation category, and so they're flagged as red. Unfortunately, we've had a few negotiations that have stalled out, and we've been through the county commission to get approval to move forward with the eminent domain action. And so we're going to continue to show those as they progress. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next agenda item. Otherwise, in the packet, it's sort of the usual type report. I didn't have anything specific to point out, but happy to answer any questions if you have any. I would say that we continue to be on progress and on schedule. I think in the last few weeks or month, we have been able to negotiate some acquisitions that I was worried about, but we've been able to negotiate a few of those. And as I said earlier, of course, there's some that we have reached an impasse on.
Okay, thank you. Questions for Eric? So at this point, you feel like we're on time?
I do, yes. I will say, just looking forward, I'm showing on the screen right now the upstream mitigation area for North Dakota, and this is a pretty big chunk of acquisitions that we need to acquire flowage easements and some upstream structures. That's an awful lot of work to be done, and we're anxiously awaiting the FEMA Clomer approval, and we're also anxiously awaiting to get through the contested case hearing where we might have some final permit conditions on the Minnesota side. Once we get through those 2 steps, I think we're going to be pushing hard to start appraisal work on the upstream, at least on the upstream structure part, and that's going to be a pretty hefty workload for the next several years. So.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Eric? Okay, then let's move on to item number 5, the property acquisition process review. I asked Eric just to go over this a little bit because we have had 2 Cass County Commission meetings now where we have had to be part of the process for that quick take. And a couple of individuals have indicated that perhaps the process wasn't followed. That didn't seem to be the consensus of the county commission, but I just, we've got, I think, 70 more to go through. These are extremely time-consuming but important meetings that we're having going through this individually with property owners. But I just thought it would be a good time now to just take a pause and make sure that this committee has an opportunity to review that process again and make sure that there's nothing that we're missing and that we can go forward with the process as we've been doing so far. So go ahead, Eric.
Sure, thanks, Chair. So in your packet here, what I included is a handful of pages from the latest mitigation plan. This plan is posted on the project website. This version of the plan has been approved by the state engineer in North Dakota, and it's part of the ongoing discussions through the contested case hearing. But the sections that I included here relate to our acquisition philosophies, the acquisition process, and then there's this starts on page 5 in your packets. And then on page 17 in your packet is a summary of the sort of negotiating process as we've framed it out. And so good opportunity to revisit all this. I think it's good, wise advice from the Commissioner Sherling to suggest let's revisit these things. I would maybe just point to a few things in here on the bottom of page 7. We talk about negotiations being a necessary part of acquisition as we're trying to acquire property from property owners, and in some cases they're willing to sell, and in fact many cases property owners have been willing to sell more than what we're asking for, and so we've been flexible in that regard. But in other situations property owners are not willing to sell, and so we really have to sit down and negotiate, and that's part of the steps we go through. And so there's some language in the bottom of page 7 that talks about counter offers, and our goal is to really reach a most equitable price for both parties. And also use eminent domain as a last resort. And that's one of the philosophies that we've employed. And I'll go into the county commission meetings isn't a whole lot of fun, but in those situations, it was a necessary step. So I guess what I would ask the committee is, take a look, read through these sections. If you have input now, great. If you have input and you want to read through it and think through some things, if there's ideas, thoughts that you have for how we might be able to improve our negotiating steps, we'd love to hear it. Again, it's a great time to reflect on how things are progressing. The next few pages in your packet talk about the typical acquisition process in Minnesota. And again, on the bottom of page 9, there's a discussion about negotiations. And there's some timelines that are established. We've generally found, and statutorily, we have a requirement to negotiate for a minimum of 60 days. We've generally found that we're going to know one way or the other within 60 days if we're going to be able to reach an agreement or not. The agreement might not actually get reached within 60 days, but you will know one way or the other whether that's possible. And then after the Minnesota section, there's a timeline, and this is sort of following the statutory steps to explain that, when we're acquiring property, there is a pretty long time frame on both sides of the river as we follow those statutory steps. Following that, on page 13 is the typical acquisition process for North Dakota. And again, on the bottom of page 13 is some discussion about negotiating steps where we have this, again, 60-day time frame for informal negotiations. And then lastly, I'd maybe turn to page 17 in your packet where we get into these offer presentation and negotiating processes. Again, welcome your feedback on these. One thing I wanted to point out here is in this second paragraph, the land agents are to serve as a primary point of contact with the property owners, and we're really encouraging these property owners to work through their land agents. Sometimes property owners get frustrated because the land agent isn't by themselves capable of saying yes or no to a counteroffer, and that puts our land agents in a little bit of an awkward point. But it's really their role to help bring the feedback from the property owners, back to a group and eventually the acquiring agencies for their input. And the land agents, these are professionals trained in doing this role, and they've got lots of experience in doing that. And so we think that having the land agents be that point of contact with the property owners is still effective, although recognize at times the property owners can get frustrated. We have changed out land agents from time to time if things are really going poorly, but generally speaking, we try to avoid that. And then on the top of page 18 in your packet, there's a little bit of discussion in here about counter offers and what might be considered in terms of counter offers and whether that's additional data. Just recently, for example, we had a property near the Horace area where the assessed value, now assessed values are not equivalent to appraised values, but in this case, the assessed value of a home went up quite dramatically from a couple years ago until right now. And so that's new data. We're evaluating that. Does it make a difference? Does it not make a difference in the negotiations? So those are things that we consider. Otherwise, I'd be happy to take any feedback or future feedback if you have it.
Thank you, Eric. Does anyone have any questions, comments?
Madam Chair, this is Corey.
Yes, please go ahead.
I have a question for Eric. Or actually a couple of things. I was going to mention too that, the city of Horace went through an appraisal process here. It's been a couple years now. And the findings of all that came out here this spring. So there was a big jump. I think the average is 29% across the city. So that doesn't surprise me that there was a jump in the appraised value on that. So just to let you know. The other thing I was going to ask was the properties that you guys are going through the condemnation process right now. Are these folks waiting to see how the contested case hearing ends, or are these just folks who have dug in their heels from the beginning and are, there's no way in Hades that this is going to happen type of thing?
The issue of the contested case hearing has not really been front and center in the acquisition of property. Everything we're working on for the most part is on the North Dakota side, and the contested case hearing seems to be more focused on the Minnesota side, but it hasn't really been part of the conversation. I think most of these property owners are arguing ultimately over value, and we've had an appraisal done. We're offering a bit more than the appraised value in most cases. And the property owners are feeling like they have a compelling case to advocate for 2 or 3 or 4 times appraised value, and I think they feel justified in their request. And the joint board, I guess, ultimately we're quite a ways apart on value and haven't been able to bridge that, so it's mostly a value issue.
Okay, that's what I just wanted to check, because I just wanted to make sure that if that was the case, if they just give them a tad bit more time, if that's what they were going to be hanging their hat on, was a contested case. But I mean, if it's just a matter of valuation, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. So that's what I had for you. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm just going to put Commissioner Breitling on the spot for a moment. His portfolio includes the water resource districts, and so he's had an opportunity to kind of follow some of this along to its somewhat conclusion at a county commission meeting. Do you have any impressions, Commissioner Breitling, on the process, and any suggestions?
I believe the process has been followed very closely, and it's been my impression that the joint board has gone out of their way to try to consider and take into consideration the property owners' comments. They are also very concerned about the fact that they are dealing with taxpayer money, and they don't feel they should be simply tossing it away and costing all of the people within the taxing district problems. With that said, I can tell you that they will be meeting tomorrow morning again, and there are 2 or 3 large parcels up for consideration, and I suspect that 1 or more of them will be approved tomorrow, if not more than that. Beyond that, it's not an easy task for that 5-member joint board, and they take it very seriously, and I think they deserve a round of applause from the citizens within the taxing district.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Eric, now in Minnesota, the process is not going to include going before the county board. Is that correct? Or the county commission?
Well, yes and no. If you recall, on the Minnesota side, Moorhead and Clay County formed a joint powers authority with the goal of acquiring the land, and I think that entity will be quite successful, but that entity itself does not have the authority to use eminent domain or condemnation actions. And so on the Minnesota side, if we reach an impasse with an acquisition, if the parcel is located within the city or outside of Clay County, then we will ask the city commission for approval to use eminent domain. And in fact, the city would have to be the entity that would do that. And lots of questions there, and I think we'll have to work through that process. If the parcel is located in Clay County, then we would go to the Clay County Commission and ask them for those steps. And so that the city and the county aren't off the hook, I guess.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Any other questions or comments regarding our process? All right, then let's move on to item number 6, crop insurance.
Yeah, thank you. So today on the agenda, we do have a brief discussion here about crop insurance study. I included the executive summary in your packet. The full report is or will be up on the project website shortly. And then also after this, we have a discussion and a brief presentation about the updated flowage easement study. I want to make sure we give enough time for Brian Field from Crown Appraisals to get into that flowage easement study. So I'll probably cover this one a little bit quickly. I do anticipate coming back to the committee again when we have phase 2 of the crop insurance study, and there'll be a little bit more detail for you as well. So if I can just hit on a few highlights here for you. In the packet again is the executive summary, relatively short executive summary of this full report. We did hire Watson Associates to put some more details together associated with the summer crop loss program that is conceptualized in our mitigation plan. And so we've hired Watson Associates. They are a firm that specializes in developing crop insurance products. They work very closely with the Risk Management Agency, who is the agency that administers Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. And so in here, on the executive summary, page 31 in your packet, the main question is, if a grower experiences a crop loss due to a flood event that is caused by the diversion authority, how will the grower be compensated for the loss? And so this phase 1 study really looks at how does the administrative framework for current federal crop insurance work, and could we piggyback onto that administrative framework to provide some supplemental coverage? If you recall, we have committed in our mitigation plan to providing the supplemental coverage for summer floods. So if the project was ever forced to operate on growing crops in the summer, those producers would not be eligible for federal crop insurance, but yet if they were damaged, they would be devastated. And so this study is aiming to put more details associated with how administratively would we provide that additional coverage. Phase 2 of the study will put more details together in terms of the cost of that coverage, cost of the coverage for the diversion authority. Also included in this phase 1 study is they're looking at really 3 risks. So we talked about the summer flood. The other risk would be prevent plant. And then the third risk would be prevented harvest. And so if there's an event out there that prevents the producers from planting their risk, to date, we've assumed that the flowage easement would compensate for that risk. But yet we wanted to study that a bit further, and the phase 2 report will put some costs associated with that prevent plant coverage, and so we can make an informed decision. I know Roger is online and he has definitely some input on that. And then the third one would be prevent harvest. And so again, if there's a scenario where the project prevents a producer from harvesting their crops, what responsibility should the diversion authority take, and what cost is it to take that? Really, those are sort of low risk type scenarios, but yet we wanted to understand that. And so phase 1 really focuses on the administrative framework for how we would provide this supplemental coverage within the administrative framework of federal crop. The Watts report goes on to explain that that's really a good approach. They view it as simple, meaning that it's time tested. Federal crop insurance program is well known by producers. There's 100% participation in the area. It's practical. The producers know how that program works. And really it's pretty efficient for us to adopt that because we'd be piggybacking on well time tested experiences. And so Watts has recommended that we provide coverage to farmers based on an endorsement to their existing federal crop insurance coverage, and the diversion authority would essentially be paying the quote-unquote premium for that endorsement. So that's a summary of what's in your packet. Again, the full report is, or it might not quite be yet, but we will load it up on the project website, and I look forward to having more discussions on this topic in the coming months as we get phase 2 report from the Watts group.
Great, thank you. Roger, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Well, not at this time. I think we have a good document here that can be supported by the farmers. I think if I was farming here, I would feel comfortable that the diversion, if it harmed me, was going to take care of me. So I think we are moving in that direction, and will only strengthen that, strengthen this document to really make the farmers feel at ease here in the staging area. That's all I have right now.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any comments or questions? Eric, is there any action that needs to be taken at this point?
No action at this point, Mary.
Okay, great, thank you. Then we'll move on to item 7, the flowage easement study.
Sure. So what I included in your packet is the executive summary, the written executive summary from the Crown Phase 1B report. But I'd also like to share with you a presentation, and Brian Field with Crown Appraisals is here with me, and I believe Tim Hodge on his team is with us virtually. We do have a presentation. For those of you that might recall, we did have the Crown Appraisal team give a presentation on their findings of Phase 1 back in December of 2018. And earlier this year, we asked Crown to update that Phase 1 study because some time has passed and there might be more comparable sales out there. And we really want this Phase 1 study to serve as a strong backbone for the ultimate valuation of the rest of the flowage easements. And so I'll give just a few introductory comments here, and then I'll turn things over to Brian to walk through this presentation. Presentation overview. I think this will be relatively short and sweet, but we have an overview of the project. We have several other mitigation programs for the upstream mitigation area. A key to those mitigation efforts is the purchase of flowage easements. And so Brian will talk about their findings of the flowage easement study. And we'll be happy to take a few questions if you have them. You're all familiar with the project. This is just a map showing the project as we know it here, and the staging area shown in that green area on the bottom. Second map here showing the 100-year floodplain after the project is in place. And so again, we have some induced flooding upstream of the project. This is the area where we need to purchase flowage easements. And here's a zoomed in version of that. This is the latest version of the upstream mitigation area map. We have broken this down into 4 distinct zones. And again, on the North Dakota side, we have concurrence from the state engineer about how we're proposing to purchase these purchase the flowage easements and specifically where we need to purchase them. On the Minnesota side, this is part of the ongoing discussions through the contested case hearing. But one thing to point out here is that the project will require temporary storage of floodwaters within these 4 different zones. And the Diversion Authority has an obligation to acquire a property right. We've assumed, that property right is a flowage easement. And the flowage easement is really one of several mitigation measures, including the supplemental crop insurance program that we just talked a little bit about. We also have established a debris cleanup, and so anytime it floods, you might understand that there's going to be a sort of a beach ridge of debris and corn stubble and gas cans or whatever it might be that float up. We've talked about providing, in fact, we've committed to providing the producers with some help in removing that debris. And then lastly on here is the dispute resolution board, and so the model is super sophisticated. And we can map out where there might be impacts, but a producer or a property owner might feel like they have been impacted beyond where we've already provided mitigation. And so in those scenarios, we've conceptualized a dispute resolution board. Some more details of that need to be stood up here in the next several months or year. But that dispute resolution board will really be an administrative process that the property owners can go to rather than having to file some lawsuit. And that dispute board would then adjudicate claims, weigh all the evidence, and try to resolve the matter. And so those are a summary of some of the mitigation programs that are out there. Again, today wanted to focus on flowage easements, but wanted the group to just be reminded that we do have other mitigation programs for the staging area as well. And so with that, I'd maybe turn to Brian if he wants to come up and give the summary of their study.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric said, my name is Brian Field, and I'm with Crown Appraisals right here in Fargo. And as he had mentioned, we initially presented to this group just under 2 years ago in December of 18 on our phase 1 flowage easement market study, which is the intent of it is to eventually implement into a phase 2 where we actually estimate the diminution in value for each of the individual parcels that will be impacted in the 4 different mitigation zones. But since it's been 2 years since that point, we were asked to update it. So we're going to call this study phase 1B. And I guess I hadn't planned on getting too really deep into the details today because we had done that before, and I think everybody here is pretty familiar with what we did. But if not, just stop me and ask a question. That's fine. And we have Tim on the line here too from Michigan. But essentially, what we were asked to do is okay, we've had 2 years since we last looked at this. Let's look at it again just to see if anything has changed, and if so, what. So we went back to the well and we went through the very same process as we went through the first time, and we had the same folks involved. Jeff Berg and I at Crown Appraisals, we're the local connection, and then we brought in Tim and Doug Hodge from Michigan. Doug is an appraiser that we have known for many, many years, who specializes in unique projects such as this, and his son Tim is an economist with Oakland University in Michigan. So we gathered a whole bunch of data all around the country to try to nail down what this flowage easement, what its impact should be on the market. So we looked at several different areas around the country. I kind of went through a lot of the things on this slide here, how it will be implemented in phase 2 once we have the NDSU egg impact studies and the hydrology studies. Once we get those back, we can apply our rates here in the appraisal process. But in our nationwide investigation, we called people from all over that we know. Fortunately, Jeff and Doug and myself are fairly well connected amongst rural appraisers who would work in these types of markets. We were able to identify markets here locally on both sides of the river, as well as in Missouri. But we did also look in Iowa and Nebraska along the Missouri River, areas that we know have been impacted. For phase 1B, we made sure to go back and check around the Omaha area again, Omaha, Council Bluffs, Sioux City, where they really had a lot of flood damage from last year's flooding along the Missouri River, to see if anything had changed there. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the biggest undertakings of this project was a regression analysis, where we collected sales over a 29-year period from 1992 all the way to today. And over the last 2+ years or so, from the original phase 1 study, we were able to find a couple hundred more sales in just the southern valley, the 6 counties of the south end of the Red River Valley here. And we kept the same parameters of our searches last time. We were basically looking within 15 miles or so either side of the river, 2 or 3 townships away, to try to keep similar quality of ground with similar production capabilities and drainage and things of that nature. All the same variables that impact market value of farmland. And as part of our market study, it's important to understand that we are really looking at 2 separate impacts. Number one, we're looking at the loss of development rights on a lot of the property, taking away the landowner's right to not per se develop it into a subdivision or some large complex, but more so into a farmstead or a rural residential building site, things of that nature. Those rights are going away. That stick is coming out of the bundle of rights. So what's that worth? And you're also losing the right to not have your property flooded. So that is worth something. And then the second part we looked at was the increased flood risk. And for that, we looked up in the northern end of the valley, north of Grand Forks, between Grand Forks and the Canadian border, where flooding is much more frequent on a lot of properties, specifically right along the river, roughly between I-29 on the North Dakota side and Highway 75 on the Minnesota side. Those properties tend to get hit a little bit more frequently, even more so than they do down in our area here. What we found is that the diminution in value from an easement, the presence of a flowage easement, was approximately 8 to 10%, and for increased flooding was in the 7 to 25% range. So the loss of property rights, this is where we looked at, as I mentioned, we looked all around the country, and the only place that we could really find anything very similar, where they have similar flowage easements that are proposed for this project up here, was down in the boot heel of Missouri, in an area called the Birds Point, New Madrid area. It's right along the Mississippi River. The Corps had bought easements way back in the 1930s and 40s, had never utilized them. But in 2011, as all the water was coming down the Mississippi and Missouri, it was pretty apparent that the town of Cairo, Illinois, which is right across the river from this portion of Missouri, it was pretty apparent that there was going to be a catastrophic loss if they didn't do anything. So for the first time ever, the Corps went in and they blew out the levee and flooded all of the acres in which they had purchased flowage easements before. So that made us look at that area to say, okay, how did blowing that levee change the value of farmland, or did it change the value of farmland? Maybe it hadn't. But what we found, looking at a lot of sales both before and after that 2011 event, is that prior to blowing the levee, there was essentially no difference in value of ground that had an easement versus the ground that didn't have an easement on it. It was no difference that was really discernible, because the levee had never been blown. It had been 80 years and people had forgot about it, and the market had forgot about it. Fast forward to 2011, the Corps comes and blows this levee out, and essentially what happened is the market just stopped. It seized. There was essentially no sales in that area for 2011. Then what we were able to observe in the couple of years following was that all of a sudden, when the market participants understood that, yeah, this can really happen and the land can be flooded without any say from us, we noticed a reduction in value of about 8 to 10% on the property that has an easement versus ground that doesn't. So that's what we identified as the value, or the diminution in value, due to the presence of a flowage easement. Then for the increased flooding risk, as I mentioned, we went up to the north end of the valley to look for that. We went back there again this time, and we were able to find a handful of additional pairings than what we had before. It did change our range very slightly up there. Not a tremendous amount. It was originally 11 to 36% diminution in value on those more flood-prone properties. But this time it has increased to 11 to 43%, but still fairly close to our original findings. So again, further support for what we had found 2 years ago. And let's see here. I would like to bring Tim in a little bit to talk about the regression study. Where do we want him at? Just a little bit to kind of explain what he did, and he can kind of give you a quick summary of that. So Tim, are you on?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So Brian could probably explain it just as well, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Brian. So what we had done, as Brian had mentioned, was we collected a large number of land sales and added to what we originally had, which gave us over 2,000 sales from which to try to identify any actual market effects from flooding. So Brian was talking about easement. This is more of the market effect of flooding. So what we were able to do with those sales was we were able to identify those that had never flooded versus those that were subject to flooding, as well as those that were subject to flooding and we knew they were within the floodplain. And so what we were able to do is to kind of, in a quick snapshot, is identify those that were subject to flooding as the treatment group and those that weren't subject to flooding as the control group. It's important to have that control group because we have to know what's happening to that control group throughout the entire process of this time. And so once a flood happens, we're able to identify through those market sales what the effect of that flooding is on the sales that actually did flood. So we used a regression analysis technique, a multiple regression analysis, where we were able to control for a number of factors that would influence the sales in order to further identify and control for differences between the sales to ensure that the control group was as similar as we could get other than the treatment effect itself. Now, I know that's a lot of jargon, and I'd be happy to take questions, but it's basically just a very standard statistical approach for identifying different effects based on whether or not a property had flooded. And what we were able to come up with, both before we updated the study, the initial report, phase 1, as well as phase 1B, was that properties that did flood during flood periods. Now, if memory serves me correct, and I should probably pull this up just to make sure it's serving me correct, is prior to the actual flood event, there wasn't any noticeable differences between flood and non-flood property, much like what Brian had mentioned they noticed in the other area. But what then happened is once the flood took effect, property that had flooded in that period and that sold during that period generally sold from about 6 to, in the regression analysis portion, about 6 to 10% or 6 to 9% less than the control group, which indicated that this flood does have a negative impact on property values once they are subject to flooding. I mean, I'd be happy to try to talk about the specifics if anybody is curious, but it can get quite burdensome quickly. Hopefully that gives you a good enough snapshot of what we had done.
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
We have a really short-term memories when it comes to flooding. So,
yes.
And it looks beautiful down by the river.
Yes.
In the middle of July. So what kind of a time frame do you limit yourself to when you review these sales?
Great question. So what we had started, I surveyed the literature, scoured the literature before this, and Fargo residents, Fargo farmers aren't the only ones with amnesia when it comes to flooding, right? It is nice to live next to water. So that was an effect that we were concerned with going in. So what we had started in this process, and the other issue with Fargo compared to typical flooding type studies, it happens infrequently, right? You think about some of these coastal floodings, it's obviously happening more and more frequently over the last 20 years everywhere. But what we've seen in the past is, you have a before flood event, then you have a post flood event, and then you have a long period post flood event before the next flood happens. And so sometimes in traditional studies, you'll see this amnesia not set in for 3, 4, 5 years. Well, Fargo has floods happening during this period of study within 5, 6 years of each other. So we recognize that, and what we first did to identify it is we said, okay, let's look at the market effect within 1 year after a flood event. And that's what this is capturing, because we recognize, oh, well, over time, people are going to perhaps forget about this, or maybe the market conditions in the commodity prices are such that, oh, who cares about flooding at this moment? Let's just buy land. And we've already forgotten about flooding. And so we looked at the 1 year period. We saw these effects happening within the first year, but then by year 2, year 3, these negative effects seemed to go away. But it was consistent, every time this flood event happens. And again, we couldn't narrow it down to one specific flood, whether it was the 97 flood, the 2009 flood. We had to kind of combine those together as a flood event, because one flood event with the number of sales isn't going to give you much statistical confidence in anything, right? There's only X number of farm sales that happen in the area a year. So, but we were able, to your point, we were able to say, okay, there is a diminishing time frame with which people seem to keep this in the forefronts of their minds. And yeah, the market isn't responding 2 years after the flood event the same way they've responded in the year of the flood event. And we did look at that.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Kevin Campbell, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. In your process here, do you take into consideration the level of impacts? For example, if a property is flooded 3 feet versus 3 inches?
Yep. So we looked at this a number of ways, and I've looked at this even more ways than are shown in the report, and it's pretty consistent. We looked at this in terms of depth. We looked at this in terms of coverage. We do have estimates that speak to each of those more specifically, because we do know that just because you flood doesn't mean you're going to have the same level of flooding as other properties. So when it came to more of a depth issue, right, we're concerned with, well, the greater the depth, the longer the dry down period is likely to be. Or with the coverage issue, right, if you are covered at 25%, that doesn't mean that planting is necessarily going to be delayed, because you have 75% of your property that can still be worked while the other portion maintains or continues to be flooded. So we looked at those different snapshots to look at that, right? When it came to percent flooded, we got a percentage basis where it was, for each percent, it's increase or decreasing the price by 0.1%. And on average, that worked out to be slightly different than our estimates. It's still within the 6 to 10% range if it's 100% flooded, but we did look at these alternate views to make sure that we were accounting for not just flooded versus non-flooded, but how does this look with different types of flood events for each property. So yeah, we did. Short answer, yes, we looked at these different flood depths and coverages in our results, and they were pretty consistent.
Thank you.
And I do want to say, and I'm sure Brian will probably get to this. I was pretty pleased to have this happen. This was something, right? This is a technique that isn't something that we came up with. It's not something that I'm, experimenting with and trying to use Fargo as a test case and showing a new regression or a new statistical package. This is a tried and true method. This is actually this study. I wrote a paper based on these findings that has been accepted for publication in Land Economics, which is a high quality economics journal that surrounds land and agricultural issues. And in that process, it was a very long process. The first submission was in 2018. It just got accepted this year, right? Where it's a double blind review process. We submit it to the journal. They send it out to other professionals, other PhD level economists in the field. They look at the methods, they give feedback, they make sure that it's appropriately modeled. The identifiers or the treatment groups are appropriately identified, And so it goes through a long 2+ year period process, and it has been accepted for publication in that journal. So that's just a testament to the methods. Again, I want to stress that because this isn't something that we are coming up with. These are standard methods accepted in the profession for looking at these types of issues.
Thanks, Tim. In the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but we thought that was a very important thing to get accomplished as part of this process, to have Tim submit that paper for peer review, to add even more credence and support to the methodology used in this report. It's very, very sound, and I think that really helps to prove that. So to cut to the chase here, the increased flood risk summary, we have what we concluded. Even though the range changed just a bit on the north end of the valley, we kept the same range in our final conclusions, where you have the two separate boxes, right? We have the loss of property rights at about an 8 to 10% diminution, and then on top of that, you add the increased flood risk of another 7 to 25% approximately, and those factors change based off of the information we'll get for phase 2, the depth and the duration of the flooding on each individual property. But if you have any more questions, you can let me know another time. But the executive summary in here, it pretty well captures what we wanted to say on the project. So I think that's all we have for time. But thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Good, and Tim as well. Thanks. Good discussion. As you can tell, we've hired some real experts here. They've done a real thorough job and documenting their evidence, which I think will bode well for us as we get going to acquire those flowage easements. Unless there's any questions, I guess I'd move on. Got just a couple other minor things in the agenda for you.
Please go on, Eric. We
Sure.
don't have a whole lot of time left before we get out.
So number 8 on the agenda is this recommendation for remnant land sale. This is on page 33 of your packet. We have a displaced property that is currently a fireworks store. You may see it along I-94. It's the Black Powder Fireworks on the map shown on the screen here on page 34 of your packet. You see the former location of that fireworks store. As we've been working through the acquisition of that property, they are interested in relocating to an area just west where we have some remnant land. And frankly, we view this as a great opportunity to utilize the remnant parcels that we've acquired. If we have a displaced property that needs a new home, why not offer them the opportunity to purchase some of that remnant land that we have? And so the joint board has agreed to this, but procedurally, they need to come and ask the land committee and the diversion board for approval as well. And so if the committee agrees with that, it would be great to get a motion in that regard.
Commissioner
Questions
Breitling,
from
I
anyone?
would so move.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is there a second?
Second by Campbell.
Thank you. Any discussion? Any discussion? Do we need a roll call vote maybe?
Sure.
Mrs. Shirley,
Yes.
Mayor Judd, Mr. Grubb,
Yes.
Mr. Campbell,
Yes.
Mr. Borboom,
Yes.
Mr. Olson, Mr. Olson,
Yes.
Mr. Breitling,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson, Mr. Peterson,
I just dialed in early.
Mayor Peterson,
Just continue, please.
That is everyone. We are missing one individual.
All right, the motion carries.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Item 9, rural impact mitigation.
Yeah, just maybe a real,
Yeah.
sorry if I may, I know we're getting pressed for time here. If I may, just real briefly, as you recall from a month or two ago, the committee and the board have approved the use of a rural mitigation program that involves a forgivable loan. We have been working with John Shockley and some of his experts at Onstead Twitchell to put some more details together on that forgivable loan. I think the basic thing we wanted to share with the committee today is that we have some property owners that are interested in that. They're looking for more details, and we're ironing out those details. A few things for your awareness is that obviously if we're providing somebody a loan, in this case, it'll likely end up being a second mortgage on that property. And anytime you're offering a mortgage to somebody, of course, there's a risk that they default on the mortgage terms. I think we understand that those are risks. We do have several mechanisms in place that would be at our disposal if those defaults did occur. And so I guess from my standpoint, I think John can attest to this as well, that we feel quite comfortable with those programs. I know John has impressed upon me that he's had success using this for other purposes in the past. And so real briefly, just wanted to make sure that that was shared with the committee. If you have any concerns, please let us know.
Do you need any action from us on this program?
I don't think so. I think the board and the committee have already sort of approved the concept, and we're just sort of working out the eaches of it.
And you'll have that at an upcoming meeting, the details?
We certainly can share that. We have a draft of the mortgage and a draft of the promissory note and a draft of sort of a term sheet that I think we need to do just a little bit more internal review on, but we can certainly share that at an upcoming meeting.
Well, it's a policy issue, and that would be very appropriate for this committee. So,
okay.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions for Eric on that mitigation program? Then the item 10, the committee update to the DA board.
Yeah, in your packet on page 44, just a brief snapshot of what's acquired, what's been happening over the last 2 months. If you recall, this committee did not meet in July. So we have had 13 parcels acquired since June. You can see the status there of formal negotiations on the North Dakota side. The Cass County Commission, as we talked about, has authorized the joint board to use last resort eminent domain on 2 different groups of property owners. We talked about the BioGeo program here today. We just heard this flow easement report. We just heard the crop insurance report, and so wanted to sort of summarize all that. I probably could have just provided you this page and had a real quick meeting, but hopefully you enjoyed the discussion.
No, it was very good presentations. Thank you. Any other questions regarding this? Then we'll move on to the joint board update. Anything for us? We've been talking, you've been busy, so anything else you want to add? Roger?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think you've heard a lot about what's been going on out there. But I just want to thank you out to Commissioner Breitling for his kind words. And give me 30 seconds here as we work through this job of purchasing property rights for the Diversion Authority. We, along with our staff and land agents, our legal staff, engineering support, we strive to come to a successful end. It pains us to move the process to the county level and ultimately to a legal end. Negotiating can continue even though we do pursue the legal end to this, and those negotiations can go on till the last hour. And that's really our goal, is to negotiate and not to send these to the court. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And please share our gratitude with the rest of your board. I recognize that this is not an easy task, and we appreciate the level of difficulty that this is.
I'll pass the kind words on. Thank you.
You bet. Anyone else have any comments or questions for Roger? Then we'll go with the Minnesota update, please.
Minnesota has not met. We're scheduled to meet tomorrow, so we'll be giving a report next month.
Great. Thank you. MetroCog, I think Adam or Cindy's there. Do you have anything to add?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Adam Altenberg. Very, very briefly, the draft recreation plan is complete, but we'll look to discuss study findings more at the next meeting in September.
Okay. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Adam. Any questions for MetroCog from the group? All right. Is there any other business? I would just add that I'm looking forward to the rest of the Crown Appraisal report. I think that they're really on the right track, and what they've done so far is pretty impressive as far as I'm concerned. Anything else, Eric? Anything else that we should know about?
Not at this time.
Okay, then it is 4:01. I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Olson adjourn, ask for adjourn.
Okay, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.